Hello and welcome all to Victorian Time Travel, the podcast where we get ready to travel back in time. We'll pick a very specific Victorian time and place each episode and try to learn everything we can about it so we don't put our foot in it once we're there. I'm Amy, your time travel researcher, and just to put you all at ease, there is some method to the madness. I do have an education in this time period, but of course, I'm not an expert on everything, so I'd be really grateful if you have the time and the energy to do so. If you could let me know when there's anything that you want to correct, especially when it comes to the sadly inescapable oppressive systems that permeated this historical period. For every episode, check out the transcript for full citations so you can find my sources and prepare even more thoroughly for your journey. Today we're travelling back in time for a trip to the theatre. We're going to go and see Madame Butterfly at the Duke of York in May 1900. Now, this is the play which Puccini saw in London and was inspired by, and on which he based his much better known today opera. And we're not talking about the opera today, we're talking about the David Belasco one-act play that the opera is based on. And we're looking at this because I love theatre and I'm half Japanese, and the opera is constantly being produced still today at the Royal Opera House and at the Met Opera. And I was just curious to find out what the original play was like. And in this episode, we're going to prepare so we can have a good chat with our fellow audience members after the show. Content warning that although it is not a focus of today's episode, if you're not familiar with the Madame Butterfly story, the main character does die by suicide at the end of the story. One thing that really jumped out to me as I was reading the script of the play is the way in which Madame Butterfly's lines are written. They're spelled out phonetically to represent, I guess, the accent that the author wanted, and it's quite wild, so that's going to be the focus of today's episode, to get us ready to enjoy the show, and so we don't spend the whole hour baffled by what's in front of us. But of course, as always, to truly blend in our time travel, we need a little bit of context. So this was by no means the first play set in Japan to grace the London stage. If anything, it joined a whole host of Japan-themed entertainment. Now, we could go on forever, or at least certainly I could go on forever, going into the Japan craze of the late 1800s, its influence on art and theatre and all sorts of things. And I'll certainly make more episodes about this. But for today, I'll just drop a few names. So hopefully, as we chat to our fellow audience members at the Duke of York after the show, we can nod along and follow their references. For theatre, rather crudely start in 1885 with The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan, which was a huge success, and it kept being staged well into the 1900s. I mean, of course, it's still staged today, but I mean, it continued to enjoy great success throughout Gilbert and Sullivan's careers. One of the origin stories of the Mikado is that it was inspired by the Japanese native village, which was a recreated village with real Japanese people living in it, and you could get a ticket and look at them go about their lives in a fake village in Knightsbridge. Maybe this wasn't the original inspiration, people are not quite decided on that, but it definitely influenced the production a lot. So already then, London audiences could see English actors playing Japanese roles, but also real Japanese people, and the village even had its own theatre you could go and watch. There were other productions in the same vein, such as The Geisha, which is an 1896 comic operetta. And the most relevant here in 1900 is a Japanese troupe headed by Otojiro Kawakami and Sadayako. They were a Japanese touring theatre company, and they were actually in London performing in May 1900. So that's why I picked this date. And I'll certainly make an episode about them, don't worry. It's so fascinating, their story. But I'm just flagging that if we go and see a later performance of Madame Butterfly, which opened in April, but if we go in May, we could make that comparison with the real Japanese troupe playing over in Notting Hill. Basically, Madame Butterfly is coming to the stage at a time when there is an interest in all things Japanese that's been going on for a couple of decades now. And before moving on to the background of the play itself, I'll do the quickest recap of the plot in case you're not familiar and you don't mind spoilers for a 120-odd-year-old story. The premise is that Chocho-san, a Japanese woman who has had a child with an American man, is waiting for said man to return because he's gone back to America. And it's been 2 years of absence, and the play joins Chocho, the Madame Butterfly of the title, on her final day and night of waiting. And while he was away, her American husband remarried because she believes they were married, he doesn't. So Chocho is heartbroken to find this out and takes her own life. If this story sounds familiar, it's because it's been done over and over and over again. The musical Miss Saigon is an updated version of the same story, and it's an enduringly popular narrative. David Belasco's one-act play is an adaptation of a short story by John Luther Long, and the plot is broadly the same, and Belasco and Long collaborated on the script. They wrote it together, although there are some significant changes between the short story and the play, which I'll cover in a moment. In terms of the origins of the John Luther Long story, the two main origin stories are found are that it was inspired by Madame Chrysanthème by Pierre Loti, a French novel from 1887, or that it was based on an anecdote he heard from his sister, Mary Jane Jenny Long Correll, who lived in Japan for over 50 years as a missionary with her minister husband. I'll flesh out both origin stories, and it's perfectly possible that the truth is a combination of both, of course. So, the one that we're most likely to be talking about with our fellow audience members after the show is the Pierre Loti novel connection. Now, this is fairly commonly referred to as the original inspiration in scholarship today in the 21st century. For whatever reason, I don't quite see it, but I'm sure that's just me. So I'll lay out the facts and you can decide for yourselves if you see the connection or not. So in Madame Chrysanthème, we have a semi-autobiographical lead character, a French man, who goes to Japan and takes on a temporary wife. They don't really talk to each other very much, and she doesn't speak French. He speaks a little bit of Japanese, but it's him who narrates the story and him who tells us that he speaks Japanese. We don't really get to see him do it very much, so his level isn't very clear. And it's mostly about physical companionship for them. The story is a fairly somber one of, a guy hoping that if he runs far away enough, he'll finally be happy. And then he goes all the way to Japan from France and gets his live-in temporary wife, and it doesn't make him happy. And they're both miserable. And it's not really a tragedy in the classical sense. Nobody dies at the end. The stakes are pretty low. It's just depressing in the way that regular lives are depressing. And in the end, spoiler alert, he leaves. Everyone could see it coming. It was a temporary arrangement all along. He leaves behind some money, and the final view he gets of his companion is her counting up the money, not even looking up. So it's not a very sentimental novel. Now, as you can see, beyond the premise of a Western man going to Japan and taking on a temporary wife, there's not a huge amount more that overlaps with the Madame Butterfly narrative. Of course, John Luther Long may have been intrigued by the setting and inspired by its popularity. Long's sister, Mary Jane Jenny Long Correll, who I'll call Jenny from now on, gave talks about how her experiences in Japan as a missionary were the inspiration for the short story. Now, she wouldn't give these talks until much later on, when the play and the opera had become very popular. So the average theatregoer of 1900 wouldn't know this story, so let's not bring it up with them, but I'll give it here just for us to know. Her version is that she was visiting her brother back in the US and told him about an anecdote. Depending on the source, this is something she witnessed herself or that an acquaintance of hers witnessed. And in this story, we get the name, Cho-san, turned into Cho-Cho-san for the novel, the abandonment at the hands of a young American man, the young Japanese woman waiting for his return with a baby by the shoji, the paper screen sliding door. Two big things that are not present in Jenny's anecdote, nor in John Luther Long's short story later on, are that Cho-Cho-san is not a former geisha. And very significantly, she doesn't die at the end. In the original anecdote, she's a tea girl, and she's a quite pathetic figure. I'm using pathetic in the literary sense, by the way, like she has pathos. I'm not saying she's pathetic. But there is no indication as to what happens to her following the abandonment. And as far as we know, we are free to believe that she just keeps living her life. In John Luther Long's story, it's hinted at that she may have been a geisha, but it's not explicit. And at the end, she does try to slit her throat, but is saved by her maid, and she survives. So it's David Belasco's play that confirms the geisha background and the tragic death at the end. Why did he do it? Perhaps because those things feel very Japanese, whether they are or not, and maybe he just wanted the play to have a neat tragic ending rather than an open-ended one, perhaps. What both these stories have in common is that they are from the perspective of the Western people telling it. We don't really know what was going through the minds of the Japanese people involved. And while both Pierre Loti and Jenny Long Corel had been to Japan, as far as I can figure out, John Luther Long and David Belasco had not. There were Japanese communities outside of Japan at this point, including in the US, so I'm not saying that they wouldn't have met any Japanese people, but it's something to keep in mind when considering the way in which Madame Butterfly expresses herself in the play. Now, on to the event we're attending. May 1900, Madame Butterfly has already been running at the Duke of York for about a month at this point, to largely positive responses. It's a great success. I'm choosing this time because, as mentioned, there was a Japanese troupe of actors performing in London at the same time in May, and I think it'll be interesting to hear what people who've seen both are saying. The play opened in New York in March 1900. Then David Belasco himself travelled to London and directed the production here. So it should be his original vision that we're going to see. And the title role was performed by popular London actress Evelyn Millard. So our evening starts at 8 p.m. at the Duke of York Theatre. But we won't be sitting down to watch Madame Butterfly at this time. We'll be seeing Jerome K. Jerome's comedy, Miss Hobbs. Theatre goers and theatre companies in 1900 were hardcore, and we're going for a double bill with much of the same cast and presumably the backstage crew as well. Miss Hobbs is at 8 p.m. and then Madame Butterfly is at 10 p.m. Actress Evelyn Millard will play the lead character in both plays. It's intense. And we won't go into Miss Hobbs here. We'll just have to watch it and enjoy once we're there. But I'll link the script in the transcript if you want to prepare. For our purposes, suffice to say that it's a romantic comedy in 4 acts about a strong-minded woman trying to resist falling in love, and it's set in New York. And following this, reviewers of the time noted that the Japanese story enjoyed the benefits of effective contrast. At 10 p.m., presumably after an appropriate interval to allow for an extensive set and costume and makeup change, Madame Butterfly starts. And in order to transport us from a New York drawing room to a village in Japan, this is what happened, as described by a Sporting Gazette review. 2 Japanese servants were sent to bow before the tableau curtains, and then followed a succession of curtain drops representing scenes in Japan. Dawn, sunset, and night. And watching these, the audience felt that they had spent days in the country and now only longed to see the inside of the little house at the foot of Fujashi Hill. That should be Higashi Hill. It's an error in the review. I believe here by Japanese servants, they mean actors or stagehands perhaps, dressed in the Japanese style. I really can't wait to see these tableaus live when we time travel, as the visuals were a large part of the attraction in Belasco's plays. Osman Edwards, who wrote a book titled Japanese Plays and Playfellows in 1901, notes of Belasco in a sort of backhanded compliment kind of way, that as a director he relies greatly on the electrician and the limelight man, and it is to them the credit should go for the most exquisite scenes in Madame Butterfly. Ouch. So we've been eased into the change in setting, and now we see Evelyn Millard transformed into a young Japanese woman. And according to promotional photos from the time, she wore a big black wig in a kind of stereotypical Japanese updo shape, with flowers adorning the hair and a light-coloured kimono. And as far as I can tell, the makeup is kept quite minimal and neutral, and the only change I can see by comparing pictures of Evelyn Millard's Madame Butterfly's portraits with other portraits of her is the shape of the eyebrows, which are made to be straighter at the ends rather than curving down at the temple, so they kind of point directly out. The visual transition is now complete, and then she talks. And Millard is an English actress, and she may have been using an American accent for Miss Hobbs. I'm not sure, but I assume so. But what she uses as Madame Butterfly is certainly a different accent. Although there are sadly no sound recordings I could find, we can try and prepare ourselves by looking at the script and at contemporary reviews. And let's start from the script, which, by the way, retains a lot of the non-standard spellings from John Luther Long's short story. So Belasco isn't adding the accent in, it's something that's already there in the source material, but he's definitely taking it and running with it. Here are the rules, I use that term very loosely, that I could identify by reading the script. 1. Madame Butterfly appears to struggle with multisyllabic words, and this is shown in the script by breaking up words with dashes, such as lef, ten, nant, pic, cur, ton. And the first time this appears in the script is followed by the stage direction, she pronounces his name with much difficulty. So we know that that's what the dashes mean. 2. She makes grammatical errors such as, that grandmother, how are she? 3. She often drops the end of words, tellin, anything, unite, state for United States, most gone. So she elides ing endings as well as Ds and Ss and Ts. And her lines are often spelled phonetically in sort of idiosyncratic ways, such as everybody, whichever, money. That's all spelled with A's in places that they shouldn't be. So that's everybody. So like the regular everybody, but with an A at the start. Whichever has an A before the ever, which A ever. And money is spelled Moaneys. So both a grammatical difference, monies, plural, and also the first part of the word is spelled, I guess, like moan, monies. And all these spellings presumably would make the vowel sounds sound stretched out. The in-world explanation for Cho-Cho-san speaking in English, even when she's alone at home with her Japanese maid Suzuki, is that she wants to keep her house as American as possible while her husband is away. In the first few lines, she tells off her maid for counting in Japanese because, and I will attempt a read here in my own accent, but with the alternative spellings. How many time I tellin you, no one shall speak anything but those United States languages in these Lieutenant Pinkerton house. Since Pinkerton has been gone for 2 years when the play opens, this suggests that Madame Butterfly hasn't been able to communicate freely with anyone for the past 2 years, even when she's in private and with other Japanese people, which is a rather sad thought. She's made herself talk in a language that the stage directions state she has much difficulty with all the time. One thing that really confused me at first when it comes to how her lines are written in the script is that it's quite inconsistent. As mentioned, what I called rules are more like inconsistent patterns. She struggles to pronounce her own husband's name, which she presumably has quite a lot of practice with. Yet at one point she says, I have brought a sacrifice of flowers and new rice, with no alternative spellings at all. And her level of understanding varies as well. Early on, she sings a made-up song that Pinkerton used to sing to her, with simple lyrics such as, I call her the belle of Japan, her name it is O Cho-Cho-san, Cho-Cho-san. And the stage direction, you've guessed it, directs the actress to sing as though not understanding a word of it. But later on, when another character tells her that life for her son would be difficult should he move to America, he says, such unfortunates never rise above the stigma of their class. They are shunned and cursed from birth. And she understands that, no problem. Why is that? Well, I have my theories, so hold on to that thought and we can make some guesses later. But before doing that, let's try and figure out how the actors interpreted these alternative spellings by looking at some writing from the time talking about the play. So here's a little roundup. The Pall Mall Gazette review says that the broken English of the Japanese characters is often barely intelligible. The Glasgow Herald noted that Cho-Cho-san's broken English is apt to be intermittent, so they picked up on the inconsistencies perhaps. A collection about the year's premieres called her accent Anglo-Japanese and fairly interesting. Edwards, in that Japanese Plays and Playfellows collection mentioned earlier, notes that the strange broken American jargon and the silly monotonous song which Miss Evelyn Millard had to say and sing, though legitimate enough, were tiresomely out of harmony with the grace and beauty of her movements, her looks, and her costume. What we can gather is that it definitely sounded distinctive to contemporary audiences, a bit strange and foreign, and possibly hard to understand and out of place. The effect was varied. Some found that it made her more sympathetic by showing her isolation, and others, such as the reviewer for the Pall Mall Gazette, found her barely intelligible, and he found that it made it hard to empathize with her, and her broken speech was one of the reasons he was little moved by the heroine's death at the end. Now, one last thing to consider before we start speculating about why Madame Butterfly might have been written like that is how Japanese actually sounds. Now, I'm not a linguistics expert, and I will base what I say on how Japanese sounds now, as a little disclaimer. One thing about the Japanese language is that it's syllabic, so there's almost never a consonant or consonant cluster without a vowel. So, for example, there's no sound in isolation, it's always ka, ki, ku, ke, ko. Japanese also typically has no diphthongs, as in English, gliding vowels that morph into other vowels, like the O in hello. This really added to my confusion and curiosity when reading the script because Cho-Cho-san's accent is very inconsistent with this. For example, a Japanese speaker would typically be more likely to stress the final consonant in United States, perhaps, by adding a vowel at the end of each word rather than elide it, as in the script, Unite State. They would also tend to turn vowels into monophthongs and Japanese vowels rather than distort them and stretch them out. So, for example, money may perhaps become mani or moni, perhaps, if they learn the word by reading, sooner than becoming, as in the script, Moni. So finally, let's speculate about the reasons behind her being written this way. One inescapable thing is that while the way Cho-Cho-san speaks doesn't really line up with how a Japanese speaker specifically would sound, it does look a lot like the way in which another kind of speaker was written, and that's African American characters in stories, plays, and songs at the time. Now, this could be as simple as the authors, Long and Belasco, somewhat lazily default into a kind of non-standard speech pattern that sounded familiar and plausible. Or it could be them deliberately conflating all people who spoke English in a non-standard way as one type. But whether it was their intention or not, the effect is that we have the American characters speaking with an American accent, presumably, and the Japanese characters using an accent somewhat adjacent to one that the audience might recognize as the African American accent, at least the version of it that is seen on stage, if not that of real African American people. This, whether on purpose or not, comes with rather heavy connotations in terms of the dynamics between characters. So the purpose of having Cho-Cho-san speak in this way may be to make her generically other to the reader or audience member, whether the similarity with the stage version of the African American accent is deliberate or not. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that we'll be watching the play in London rather than in New York, and here people perceived Pinkerton and the other American characters as other too, to some extent. In fact, that reviewer in the Sporting Gazette that we mentioned earlier noted that the civilized American judged everyone from his own standpoint and, being incapable of fidelity himself, imagined that no one could love and trust and wait. And in this way, it's almost as if the distance created by the Western character being American helps the British reviewer to feel sympathetic towards the Japanese character. Another effect of this othering that the speech pattern is part of is that much of the script doesn't read like a tragedy at all. In fact, the Morning Post praised Belasco in its review for not labeling it as a tragedy, as it had, according to the reviewer, a comedy spirit. Belasco, by the way, did call it a tragedy when he published the script years later, but not in the 1900 promotional materials, I guess. Here we can return to Pierre Loti, author of Madame Chrysanthème, who had his narrator muse that his story might have developed into a drama were it not for the narrowing and dwarfing influence of Japan, turning everything into ridicule. The Morning Post reviewer wasn't the only one to find the play comedic. Audiences laughed, and other reviewers found that the ending didn't quite fit with the rest of the play, as it was too violent compared to the prettiness and gentleness of the rest of the play. And this doesn't seem to be a mistake, as the play does include sequences that read like slapstick comedy. For example, where the characters of Nakodo and Sharpless first visit and they start this routine where everyone stops talking and bows every time a family member is mentioned. And of course, family members keep getting mentioned, so we can see them do it again and again and again. And the unusual way in which Madame Butterfly speaks is not dissimilar from how comic characters spoke. So perhaps the jump in tone from the first half of the double bill with Miss Hobbs wasn't quite so jarring after all. So the accent may be used to create distance between the audience and the characters, to suggest a power dynamic, to make the play lighter and funnier. One more guess is flavor. Possibly the same reason Long and Belasco set the story in Japan in the first place, to be able to use the pretty outfits and sets and props and to experiment with the aesthetic style of Japan. Actually, quite a few reviewers do note that really the only thing that's new in this play is the setting and the identity of the heroine, and that apart from that, it's just another miserable marriage play, which apparently were a popular trend. Miserable marriage plays. Another reviewer says, in reality, it is a very commonplace story of betrayal and desertion. Its setting and the manner in which the plot is developed are entirely new. Overall, my perhaps not too generous feeling is that David Belasco didn't mind that the way in which Cho-Cho-san is written may have made her less sympathetic to some audience members, that it may have alienated them or made her feel too different and other to identify with. I think it seems that he was quite happy for the Japanese identity of the character to just be an element of interest and didn't really try to make her Japaneseness an embodied characteristic. I think if we were meant to identify with Cho-Cho, her level of understanding of English would be more consistent, because we, as the audience, should be able to follow with her what she understands and what she doesn't. But since we are firmly on the outside looking in, I think Belasco is fine with the fact that sometimes her understanding doesn't really make sense. Or with the fact that the ending is somewhat spoiled by the fact that there's a great big sword in the room from the very start, and one of the characters reads the inscription on it, something about dying with honor when one can no longer live with honor, after which, some reviewers pointed out, they kind of saw it coming. I think it's not concerned with the verisimilitude of Madame Butterfly having been a geisha, rather improbable, by the way, at her age, or of her feeling that she must die because of dishonor. Never mind that that's not really something women did, and that the concept of dishonor isn't really applicable here, I would say. I mean, Cho-Cho-san could have died because she has a broken heart, but Velasco doesn't give her this sympathetic motivation, preferring to go with the pseudo-Japanese honor explanation. I think he's just playing with the theme and the setting and the tone, and, he's doing it very well since the play is a great success. So, now that we are psychologically prepared for the show, we're ready to travel back in time and go to the Duke of York Theatre. Some of the talking points with our fellow audience members could be about how transformed the actress Evelyn Millett was, how great the contrast was from the first play of the evening. Be prepared to either use, if you really want to fit in, or at least be ready to hear the word little being used a lot. Little play, little tragedy, little dollhouse for Cho-Cho-san's house. That keeps coming up in reviews. Little, little, little. If we want to sound a little more intellectual, since it's May 1900 already, we can mention that yes, this was great, but it can't really compare to the real thing. A Morning Post reviewer points this out. Once Kawakami and Sadayaka's troupe open in Notting Hill, they go back to see Madame Butterfly and they say, beautiful and fascinating though it be, Madame Butterfly had lost some of its convincing power once its audience attended the real Japanese play at the Coronet Theatre in Notting Hill. Some audience members may surprise us and be quite observant and point out that the play is quite Western in content despite the visuals. Others, such as a certain Penelope writing in a ladies' column in a weekly magazine in June 1900, may quite disagree. Sure, The authentic Japanese performers in Notting Hill are an interesting novelty, but in her words, Evelyn Millard as Madame Butterfly, the Duke of York's Theatre in London, makes a much more fascinating Japanese beauty than any of the real Japanese geishas I have lately seen. When I get there, I mostly just want to listen and find out what the average theatre goer thought. We can read the opinions of professional critics in the papers, but did the average person think more like Penelope? Did they find the play funny? Or sad? How many stopped to think about whether this was a fair representation of Japanese values, and how many didn't even stop to question it? Really, what I would like to do is to stand there with a clipboard and do a survey, but I fear that may well and truly give me away as a time traveler. Thank you all for listening to Victorian Time Travel. Dress up in period appropriate warm clothes, have a good trip, and stay safe.